We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 this morning. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And the series we're in right now is just kind of doing these yearly check-ins, things that we need to think about because they're right there in front of us. We've talked about marriage, we've talked about parenting, and today we're going to talk about how we should view our money. How we should view our money. The reason we're going to talk about such things, it seems pretty obvious, but it's something that's right there in front of you all the time, and when it's not right there in front of you, you kind of miss it. But also, our money is not an end, and so many people in life make it an end. Money, from what we'll see in today's sermon, is a means to an end. It's something God gives us so that we can accomplish things for Him that are great. You ever have the old guidance counselor ask you this question? If you had all the money in the world, right? You were a multi-billionaire, you're a trillionaire even, what would you do with your life? Okay. So guidance counselors use that to show life isn't about money. You need to think about vocation, how God has gifted you, what can you contribute to this world. So if you had no money in the world, or all the money in the world, and didn't have to worry about it, what would you do? And that supposedly should be your career that you should follow. Okay. Now, some of us, even if we had all the money in the world and we had dreams of, I'd love to be a star in the NBA. If you're a good guidance counselor, you should say, well, you can't jump very high, Elijah, so maybe let's think about something else, right? So I chose pastor because MBA didn't work out. Not really. But yes, if you had all the money in the world, what would you do in life? And beyond that, what would you do with your money? If you didn't have to worry about it, if you didn't have to worry about money, what would you do with all of it? That's a question you ought to ask yourself, because here's what we're going to see today as we look at this text. You don't have to worry about money. You serve the God who owns everything, right? And He will freely give you all things. If He gave Himself, God came down to this earth and died in my place. If God did that, then why can't I trust Him and not worry about money? And so therefore, how should I look at my money? Well, we're going to learn today from this chapter what Paul, who wrote this, wants us to think about money. Right? So first we need to kind of give the historical background of what's going on here, because we're jumping into the middle of a letter where he's telling this church about all kinds of things. In fact, he's already talked about money in chapter 8. And as I thought about preaching on finances, I thought, should I go with chapter 8 or chapter 9? And I chose chapter 9. But let's first talk about what is Paul talking about in this letter, since we're jumping in. So Paul first starts by talking about giving to the Jerusalem church. That's the context of what's going on here. So what's going on is in the early church when it formed, it started out in Jewish places, right? The first time the Holy Spirit came down upon the church was at Pentecost, and they were all in one accord in the temple. The temple was a very Jewish place. No Gentiles were allowed inside it. And then as the church grew, it grew throughout Jerusalem, Judea. Okay? And as it grew through Jerusalem, Judea, these are all Jewish people who have grown up accustomed to the Hebrew Bible. So it appeared that God and Jesus Christ had died for the Jewish people, so therefore the church ought to be Jewish. That's what everyone thought. So if you wanted to enter the church, you would have to become Jewish, even if you were, like me, as white as, cotton and, German or whatever. You'd have to become Jewish. So you'd have to go through certain Jewish rites to have that happen. And the church, as you read the book of Acts, they're stunned when God actually sends His Holy Spirit to non-Jewish people. First, He does it to Samaritans, which are like half-breed Jews. And then He does it to Gentiles. And the church is just stunned. Wow, what is God doing? Okay. And you can read about that in like Acts 11 and 10 when Cornelius receives the Spirit and his whole household. But as God grants the Spirit to the church, you find the church is composed of more than Jews and Gentiles, yet it still started with the Jewish people. So there's this expectation still that you should probably do all the Jewish regulations in order to be part of the church. So that includes things like be circumcised. That includes things like eat with certain dietary restrictions, right? It means no bacon or shrimp for you, so no shrimp-wrapped bacon, right? But as the church is thinking through this, you find that factions arise within the church. There are disputes. Sometimes we think of the church as just idyllic and no problems in the book of Acts. It doesn't come till much later in church history. But you have problems starting right out in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 6, you have non-Jewish widows who feel neglected because of money and the distribution of food and goods. Acts 15, we find a dispute arising. In verses 1 to 2, it says, "And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren," that's the name of the people in the church, the brothers, "unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension," okay, you got to work out the negatives in here. Therefore, when they had no small dissension means, therefore, when Paul and Barnabas were fighting this out, right? No small dissension is a nice way of saying when there arose a very big argument over this and dispute with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. Okay? So you can see the church could fragment at this moment because there's Jewish side and the Gentile side, and the Jewish side wants to keep customs. The Gentile side doesn't want to have to do that. If I were a Gentile male, I would say to a Jewish person, boy, it's easy for you to tell me I ought to be circumcised. You had it done on the 8th day. I'm a 41-year-old man. I don't want to go through that surgery right now. And that's kind of what's going on here at the time, right? So, what is Paul going to do? How is he going to use his abilities to help the church not be fragmented? Well, one thing that's going on in Jerusalem at the time, and this might contribute to the grumpiness going on, is there is a famine in the land in Jerusalem. And in Acts 11, verses 27 to 30, you can see that the church decided to send this Paul and Barnabas on this kind of financial tour. It said, "In those days the prophets came up from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to all the brethren dwelling in Judea. This they also did and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul." So what God does is sends Paul and Barnabas into all the churches that are Gentile to collect money for the mother church that is in Jerusalem. And the amazing thing that is accomplished with that is Paul unites the church by having the kind of superior mother church be supported by all these, what in their mind might be lesser Gentile churches. All these uncircumcised churches, all these churches with people that eat bacon all the time and don't follow all the Jewish regulations. So Paul goes on this tour, this missionary tour, and gets all these churches from like Macedonia, Corinth, and Thessalonica, all these churches to contribute to help this Jerusalem church. Because Jerusalem was hit the hardest by the famine at this time. Okay? And then Paul gets in Jerusalem, and what more does he do? Even though Paul has clearly said, look, you don't have to be circumcised, you don't have to follow dietary regulations to be saved, he gets to Jerusalem, and the pastor there, James, says, look, Paul, and he says this in Acts 21 to 24. We won't read that, we'll just kind of summarize it. James says, look, Paul, this whole Jerusalem church thinks you're going around telling people to ignore the Mosaic law. in order to just comfort them, can you do something for us? Can you go into the temple and can you pay for these other young Jewish men who are making Jewish temple vows? Can you pay for that? And Paul says, sure. And in doing that, the poor guy gets arrested because they're claiming he's trying to be a rabble-rouser. And all he's doing is actually bending the knee to James in his, what I think is a kind of over-scrupulous request. Paul could have told James, no, I'm not going to support that temple. The glory left that temple. The temple was Jesus Christ, and these Jewish people killed him, and he rose again, and he's in heaven. So this temple, there's nothing good going on in here at the time. From the time Christ was crucified and that temple the curtain was shorn from top to bottom, that temple, there's nothing going on here anymore. But instead, Paul says, all right, I'll pay for these guys to make their vow. I'll humor you. I will bend over backwards using what? Money. Again, Paul understands money can glue this church together so that there, to this day, thankfully, shouldn't be a Jewish church and a Gentile church. There's one church in Jesus Christ. Right? So what Paul is doing is encouraging here in 2 Corinthians 9 the church to give to this financial support of Jerusalem. That's the historical reality of what's going on here in 2 Corinthians 9. And really, all he's encouraging them to do is what the church has already done that you find in Acts 2, verses 44 to 45, or Acts 4, 32 to 37. And here's what the early church did when they formed. It says, now all who believed were together. They had all things in common. They sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need. So the early church realized we're here to help each other. The finances God gives me is to help everyone in the church. That I'm here to help. That God blesses me so that I can help. So with that whole context in mind now, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and read what Paul's advice is for them when it comes to having this attitude of using your money to give. Okay? And here's what Paul says in verse 1. Now concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous to me to write to you. So he's saying, I know I don't even need to tell you to do this because you're doing well with this, but I'm going to tell you anyway, right? Repetition helps you get things down. But for I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. So Paul, apparently a year ago, had been in Corinth and said, look, we need to give money to Jerusalem. They're struggling. The famine is really hitting them hard. And the church of Corinth was like, yes, let's do it. Sounds great. So what did they need to do? They needed to go gather the money. They didn't have ATMs back then where they could just go get it immediately or write checks. It was a process. But it's a process that's been going on about a year now. And Paul's saying, look, let's get this done. Let's finish the good work. All right? Let's not just have it up here in the air anymore. Let's get it done. Your zeal, in fact, stirred up other churches. So other churches were encouraged by how excited Corinth was to get on the bus with this activity. So Paul says, verse 3, yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that, as I said, you may be ready. So Paul sent some people on ahead of time to help them prepare to do this giving. Lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this, confident boasting. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity, not as a grudging obligation. Okay? So Paul says, I sent these guys so that you would be ready to give, but generously. Notice in this whole passage, Paul just bends over backwards to never command them to do anything with money. He doesn't boss them around. He doesn't say, you must. He says giving can only come from a heart that's overflowing, not from a heart that must. And that's what you find in the New Testament. When it comes to giving, it's all about God changing your heart about it. So that's why I want to preach on this morning, to change your heart, not to change your actions because you're doing something you must do, but change your heart so that you can see the wonderful privilege of being allowed to give. That last thing he said there in verse 5, he said, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. So what Paul is doing here and is helping us to view our money in this way. We should view our money as a way to help others in need. We should view our money as a way to help others in need. That's what goes in your blanks there. And not only that, our giving should come from a generous one, not an obligated one. Right? That's why I, as a pastor, don't say to you and command you that a tithe is required. Right? There's a question in the New Testament, must we tithe our finances? Well, I don't find the New Testament commanding you about money. I find the New Testament saying, give generously as the Lord moves. So you know what that means? It means that a lot of times you give more than a tenth. It means that God's going to bless you sometimes with money so that you just pass it right along. And I have seen this over and over and over in my life, where the Lord blesses someone with money, they bless it with someone else, and things explode from that point on. I'll just share one example with you. You may have heard of there's a big speaker, at least in our circle, which is a small circle, the GRVC, but a guy named Ken Rudolph, who used to speak at all of these youth events, and I think he still does. He's just getting pretty old now. But Ken Rudolph worked at Baptist Bible College, and my dad, in 1993, moved my family to Baptist Bible College so that he could go to Bible school. So we didn't have a lot of money, right? He was a manager at a fast food restaurant, giving most of his money to college tuition. And, my mom was homeschooling us, so we didn't live on much. Well, one day, Ken Rudolph came up to my dad and said, the Lord just impressed on my heart to give you this money. And he gave my dad a $20 bill. Not a ton, right? But to a college student, that's like 20 visits to the vending machine at least. So that's lunch for a month, right? When you're in college. But so Ken Rudolph gave Dad that $20. He knew my dad. And my dad took that money and bought the first materials so that we could start a puppet ministry. And when I was a tween, before I was even a teenager, our family had a family puppet ministry. We would go to churches and do VBS. We would go to nursing homes and assisted living homes and do these puppets. And I'm a huge Muppets fan. I was really into puppets because of just growing up doing puppets. And it all started, this little seed, with this $20 from Ken Rudolph. Those puppets that started with Ken Rudolph's seed money went literally all over the world. They went to Africa in the very least. My dad, in Ghana, they took a mission trip there. My dad also trained others with the same pattern from this book that he bought for less than $20. That was one of the things he bought. It was a book on how to make puppets using glue and carpet padding. My dad trained other people to make puppets using those same principles. Their puppets went to somewhere South America, maybe Chile. These puppets have gone all over the world, and the gospel has been spread through the use of puppets, all because Ken Rudolph decided to give my dad $20, which might not seem like much, right? In this day and age, if you go like this with the gas pump, you'll have put $20 in it, right? That's how far $20 will get you. Yet this $20 went all over the world with the gospel. Okay, so I want to encourage you. Giving should come from a generous heart, not an obligated one. You see, if Ken Rudolph had spent his tithe, if he had taken his paycheck and said, okay, 10%, I'll give that to my church, now my giving's done. If he had done that, he never would have given my dad $20, and that $20 spread the gospel all over the world through the use of puppets. Right? So we ought to look at our money in this way. That is how I want us to look at our money. That's what Paul is encouraging us with this background here that we have shared this morning. So in 1 to 5, we kind of see this background. Here's the situation going on. We want to be generous givers. Well, here's what Paul does for us. He gives us assurance of provision. You might think, okay, if I'm generous with my money, if I'm just giving it to everyone, what's going to happen? Am I going to be taken care of? Am I going to be protected? How do I take care of my money? Or how do I take care of my family if I'm just giving away money all the time, right? And we need some financial responsibility. Obviously, I can't just put my whole paycheck in the offering every month and expect to pay any bills if I give it all to church. And Paul doesn't expect that. But let's look at the assurances Paul gives us of how God works when we're giving. Verse 6, he says this, "But this I say, he who sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one of you give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly," there's his word again, "or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And if God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you always, having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every," which is also the word all, "good works. As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever." So do you see the assurance Paul gives that if you give, God will take care of you? He uses this planting metaphor. I believe it's from the book of Proverbs, chapter 22, verse 8. Proverbs 22 is another chapter I could have preached on that talks about finances all over the place. But if you just look one verse up in verse 7, it says, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the servant to the lender." But verse 8 says this, "He who sows iniquity will reap sorrow, and the rod of his anger will fall." But verse 9, "He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives his bread to the poor." I think Paul's kind of summarizing it by saying, if you sow sparingly, you'll reap sparingly. If you sow bountifully, you'll reap bountifully, right? So what's that saying? Well, it's saying if you're going out and planting seeds, if you only drop one little seed each, you're only going to get one little plant, right? But if you start throwing tons of seeds on there, you're going to end up with all kinds of stuff. And Paul's saying, yes, it takes some investment to begin with, right? It takes, and it even takes the death of the seed. The Bible uses this as a theme for the resurrection. But it takes the death of the seed. You put that seed in the ground. You choose not to eat that seed, right? There's some seeds we like to eat. I like sunflower seeds, maybe, sesame seeds. There are seeds, coriander seeds. That's really good in some certain dishes. But instead of eating that seed, you choose to plant it, and then you get a bunch more, right? You get a bunch more of that, and that's the principle. He's using this planting metaphor. There is a cost involved, but God will give you back and even beyond that, right? Life will flourish. So what this is showing us is that we should believe that God provides all needs when we give sacrificially. Look at verse 8. I emphasized it while I was reading it, but let me just show it to you again. "And God is able to make" how much grace? "All grace abound toward you." What's grace? Well, grace is giving me things that I don't deserve. Okay? So it's saying that when I give to God, it's not that God will then just give me the exact amount back, that he keeps a ledger. Okay, he gave $10, so I will give him $10 over here. It says that God is gracious to you, right? And that is how God is to us. He's gracious. He gives us more than we deserve. He lavishes us with gifts. So it says, "And if God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, having," when are you having? How much? "Always having sufficiency." How much sufficiency? All sufficiency in how many things? All things, "may have an abundance for" how many good works? Every, or all, it's the same word in Greek, good work. Okay. So Paul is saying here, God provides all that you need, not just some of it. Don't think that God is stingy. That's a lie that Satan has been peddling since the beginning. If you remember, in the Garden of Eden, God said, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, except this one, upon which you'll die if you'll eat it. But every tree freely eat. He didn't say, you may have 5 fruits from each tree. He said, every tree freely eat. And what did Satan focus Eve on? Satan said, oh, he won't let you eat of that tree? It's like you have all of this. And he says, no, he focuses you on the one thing you don't have, right? It's like the boy who's in the room that's just full of toys and he's just sitting there bawling. And they ask him, why are you so sad? And he says, I just know these toys are going to break. They're not going to last forever. And then the other boy, I don't know if I should say this on a Sunday morning, but the other boy is in a room full of manure everywhere, and he's digging through it happily. And they say, why are you so happy? You don't have any toys in here. And he says, well, with all this manure, I know there has to be a pony somewhere. Right? So, is that allowed? I don't know. I might fail preaching class if I use those examples. But how do we look at what God has given us? Abundantly, or do we look at God as stingy? Notice the repetition. God will supply all your needs. So I would encourage you, where should we go from here? Where should we go from here? I've challenged you on the idea of giving. So here's some thoughts of how to progress. Maybe you're someone who's never thought about giving to the Lord. And I would encourage you, the way we give to the Lord is through the church. Now, I'm not saying that so that I have some great lavish salary, so that I can, drive Teslas or all the time and live in the big mansion on, in Cayuga Heights. And I'm not saying that so this church can just be all rich and lavished with wonderful things. But the way we give to God is giving to his people, that is the local church. That's where we gather our money together, okay? So, where should we go from here? Maybe you're someone who's never given to the church or never really considered it before. Number one, I would say the way you can apply today's message is start by just giving to the church. Okay? Just start your giving to the church. And you might say, well, where should I start? Well, find a way to give 10% of your paycheck to the Lord. Can you do that? They encourage us to set aside 10% for retirement. Can you live on less to give more to the Lord? And I know, what a time to preach on this, right? When gas is still under $5 here in Ithaca, at least. I'm sure if you've traveled from other places, it's over. I saw Cortland. Once they go over that $5 threshold, boy, there's no stopping it, right? But we're still in Ithaca. We're still here at $4.99. And I know it's a tough time, but boy, I got to promise you, God will give you all things if you give to him. And I'm not saying that so that you give to me so that I can live here rich and, high on the hog. Number two, something else you can look to do with your money is help those in your church with financial needs. Is that something you can do? If you're made aware of someone, maybe you can't pay all of it, but maybe you can talk to other people in the church, I know times in our lives that we've experienced financial need. For instance, when Suzanne had cancer, you end up driving a lot. And her friend got a bunch of other friends together, and they gave us a card shower, and they bought us gas cards. They also bought us just fast food cards, because inevitably when you're on chemo and you're just driving back and forth, you just need to stop for food. Your life just gets busier. You don't have time to stay at home and make a meal. Things like that. Help those in your church with financial needs. Have you ever thought of that before? Have you ever thought, boy, what can I do? What do people need? And then if you've already are doing those kinds of things, here's something else you could think about. Enlarging your percentage of what you give to the church. I knew a man in my last church, so I can brag about him and not about me, but it was just his goal to increase the percentage that he gave to the church every year. And, I'm not saying you must, because Paul never says must. He says, will you do this? Will you let the Lord lead you here? And then if you've kind of done those kinds of things, here's what else I'd encourage you to consider, because this is what the early church did. They supported ministries in other places. So support other ministries outside your church. Okay? The Lord has blessed us to the point where we've been able to, we support certain missionaries that the church doesn't support. We just have a close personal relationship with people, and I think most of these missionaries, we've been in their homes, or we've just known them so well. They're just really close friends of ours, and we just, out of our paycheck every month, we give them a little bit to support the ministries that they're doing. If you have a large amount of money and you don't want to necessarily just pass it on to your children, but you're looking to or maybe you don't have children, you're looking somewhere to distribute your money, I've got all kinds of places you can give it. And this doesn't benefit me, So we have the Northeast School of Theology and Ministry right now. I've told you about it. This is pastors in our fellowship training pastors. Right? There's a lot of money that needs to happen to make this happen. Now, we're doing this on shoestring budget. The professors that teach classes are not getting rich off of this. I'm one of them, and Jim Vogel told us, don't count on this for your retirement, folks. This isn't your nest egg. This is just making sure your gas is taken care of, stuff like that, right? But this school could use some finances just to keep its ministry going strong. Another thing, Camp Lamoka, right? Camp is doing great work, but there's always needs. Things always break down at camp, right? We know because we've got our own Callum is there as the maintenance guy. So Callum needs to buy more nails and needs to, deal with more septic tanks. And boy, ask him some of those septic stories about camp. You'll get some real stories there. There's a lot of work to be done. Camp Lamoka is doing a good work for the Lord. They're teaching kids the gospel. Give your money to camps. The Northeast Fellowship, the fellowship that we are a part of, that actually started on this location, right? And it started as the Empire State Fellowship, and it started right here with a group of churches that banded together and said, we want to take a stand for the truth and form a new fellowship of churches. To this day, we have about 180 churches. We help churches who are without pastors. Tab was one of those 2 years ago. Where did Tab get my name from? The Northeast Fellowship of Churches, okay? How did Tab get the name? Well, someone had to drive here. That driving costs money. It costs a lot of money right now. So we support, and our church does give regular support to the Northeast Fellowship. The Northeast Fellowship also trains deacons. It has seminars that go out throughout the year. It hosts a lot of conferences, and a lot of those conferences don't necessarily pay for themselves. We try to budget them so they do, but we don't budget, a lot of overflow. Northeast Fellowship, let me see, Ithaca Pregnancy Center. They are doing a good work for the Lord. If we are going to be out there and say, we don't believe in abortion, we need to help young women who have unwanted or unplanned pregnancies. We need to help them. If you were to give to the Ithaca Cortland Pregnancy Center, it would go such a long way. So I'd encourage you, these are things you can do with your finances, because Paul wants us to be giving. But when he says this in verse 8, when he speaks about how God will provide everything for you, then all of a sudden in verse 9 he does this. He quotes a psalm because he says, as it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Okay, so Paul's saying, what I'm telling you to do, it has its roots in the Old Testament, in the Bible. And so he quotes this verse. Now you look at this verse and you might think it's talking about God, saying that he's dispersed and he's given things to the poor and his righteousness endures forever, because God's righteousness does endure forever. But do you know who this is actually talking about? It's actually talking about a person who will give, a person who